So in the last lecture, we talked about the circle and shape classes. But in JavaScript, we don't have classes. We only have objects. So how can we implement inheritance only using objects? Well, here we have a circle object. We can define another object, let's call it shape, and add all the common behavior or all the common methods in this object, like compute optimum location. And then somehow we can link the circle object to the shape object. Now we refer to the shape object as the prototype of the circle. So a prototype is essentially a parent of another object. A lot of courses and tutorials make prototypes sound so confusing and complicated. It's not. Whenever you hear the word prototype, just think parent. So every object in JavaScript, except only a single object that I'm going to show you in a second, has a prototype or parent, and it inherits all the members defined in its prototype. Let me show you this in action. So here in Chrome Developer Tools on the console, I'm going to define a new object, just an empty object. Now let's inspect this. So look, here we have a property called proto. Note that this property is faded because it's deprecated and you shouldn't directly access it. It's only available here to help you troubleshoot problems. So let's expand this. All right, look, this is the prototype or parent for this X object that we created here. We have these properties and methods like constructor. You saw that in the last section. So every object has a constructor property which references the function that was used to construct or create that object. We also have this method here, toString. So let's use that method. We can type x.toString. And this is the default implementation of toString method. So we have this X object in the memory, and X has a link to another object, which is its prototype. For our discussion, let's call this object object base. It's not an official term. You're not going to find it anywhere. It's just a name I'm going to give it for our discussion. So every object that we create in JavaScript directly or indirectly inherits from object base. Object base is the root of all objects in JavaScript, and it doesn't have a prototype or parent. Let me show you. So one more time, let's inspect X. Okay, here is its prototype, which is our object base. Look, this object doesn't have a proto property. So it doesn't have a prototype or a parent. Now we can create another object here. Let's call this Y. Again, another empty object. Let's inspect it. So Y also has a prototype property, which is the same object base that you saw a few seconds ago. So here's what we have in memory. We have X and Y, and both these objects reference object base. So we have a single instance of object base in memory. I can prove that to you. So back in the console, to get the prototype of an object, we call object.getPrototype of. And here we pass X. So this is our object base with these members. Okay, now we can write an expression like this. Object.getPrototype of X. We can check if it's equal to object.getPrototype of Y. Look, both X and Y have the exact same prototype. Now you might be wondering why I didn't write this expression like this. X.__proto equals Y.__proto. The reason for this is because this property is deprecated, so you shouldn't use it in the code. But you can use it here on the console when debugging your applications. So now that you understand what a prototype is, let's define prototypical inheritance. So earlier, I accessed the toString method on the X object. We didn't define this method in our X object because X was an empty object, right? So how does this work? How can we access this method? Well, when we access a property or a method on an object, JavaScript engine first looks for that property or method on the object itself. If it can't find it, then it looks at the prototype for that object. Again, if it can find that member, it will look at the prototype of that object all the way up to the root object, which we called object base. So this is prototypical inheritance in action. When accessing a property or a method on an object, JavaScript engine walks up the prototype chain to find the target member. So once again, I want to emphasize that a prototype is just a regular object in memory. There is nothing special about it. Every object has a prototype or a parent except the root object.